All right, so we are now recording. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to do a minute or two introduction to say a couple of things, and then hopefully more of our people will join us online. Tonight is the second session, the second week in our study of the book of Samuel. And for this week's session, you did not need to read any particular text. The only thing I sent you today was a copy of the notes from last week, which reviewed the ideas of leadership we talked about. But I did not require any reading today because today is a transitional day. We are going to talk about material we have talked about before. Those of you who have been with me in the course on Judges, some of what I say today may be a little repetitious. It may be review for you. However, I've tried to organize the discussion tonight in a way that I think will be entertaining for people who have not joined us before, who haven't studied prophets before, and at the same time, we'll cover the essentials of what you have missed if you have not read the books of Joshua and Judges. So tonight is going to be a little review, and we're going to begin to lay the foundation for the beginning of our text reading next week. Today's session is called The Triumphs and the Tragedies of Tribalism. And let me explain what I mean by tribalism as we begin. Then I have a question that I'm going to ask you. All right, so I think last week, and this was reflected in my notes, I told you that over the course of Jewish history, there have been various models of leadership among the Jewish people. Depending upon the time in history that we are dealing with, there are different models that apply. The earliest part of Jewish history, which was the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, I mentioned this last week, the nature of the leadership of the Jewish people was patriarchal, which meant it was our ancestral family, our ancestral leaders. And in that case, when you're dealing with a patriarchy, usually it's a small group of people. A patriarch usually is a leader of a family group or a clan. And usually these clans or these families are not very big. It can be anywhere from an immediate family of about 10, 15, all the way up to extended families with servants and whatnot. But patriarchal families tend to be very small, and the authority over a patriarchal family is usually invested in the ancestor or the leader of the family. For example, in the time of Abraham, Abraham was the head not only of his household, but of a larger retinue of people. In the time of his son Isaac, Isaac takes on the role of patriarch. And of course, in the time of Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob becomes the patriarch leader. And Jacob happens to be blessed with a lot of children. He had 12 sons and a daughter. And each of those 12 sons will become themselves a kind of, we don't call them patriarchs anymore. The patriarchs are just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From the time of Jacob's sons, we have the beginning of the tribal system in Israel. And what is a tribal system? When I talk about tribal system, what is a tribal system? You can use any model that you want. You can talk about Native American tribes. You can talk about tribes in Africa or in Asia. A tribal society is usually a rather basic, I'm not going to say primitive, because in some cases they're quite complex, but it's usually a rather simple society. It's almost always pre-industrial. It's always a simple society. Most tribal societies tend to be agricultural, okay? In a post-agricultural age, the model of those kind of tribes doesn't apply. If you're dealing with people who subsist by hunting or by hunting gathering, that is the nature of a tribe. A tribe is a group that's a little bigger than a family. It usually consists of a group of families or heads of families. And a tribe is a confederation of people related to one another, connected with one another, but localized. Don't extend over a large area. Usually tribes only have authority over a smaller area and a smaller number of people. The Jewish people became tribes during the 210 years that they were slaves in the land of Egypt. For those of you who have studied this period, you know that each of Jacob's sons becomes the head of a family of his own. They each have large numbers of people in their tribes. Over the 210 years, we are told the Jewish people multiply. They grow from about 70 individuals, which would be a small grouping. They grow to be a very large group of people, numbering, as impossible as this sounds, as improbable as it seems, a people of about 2.5 million people, if we're to believe the fact that there were 600,000 men over the age of 20 alone, not counting women and children. So tribal societies can be bigger. Usually they are not. And over the course of Jewish history in Egypt, the people identified themselves with tribes. They were all part of the children of Israel, or the descendants of Jacob, Israel, but they identified with their father's tribes, whether it was Joseph, or whether it was Judah, or whether it was Reuben, or whether it was Benjamin, or Issachar, or Naphtali, whichever the tribe, their primary source of identification was with the leaders, often called elders, the elders of their tribes. And as I mentioned last week, the people tended to relate to the larger group through their tribal connection. Now, in the notes that I sent to you today, I indicated that this tribal arrangement continued not only while the Jewish people were in Egypt, but once the Jewish people left Egypt and they traveled and they went with Moses and they crossed the Red Sea and they went into the Sinai Desert, these tribal divisions remained very, very important. As a matter of fact, the people encamped by tribes. They moved in their wanderings by tribes. Each tribe had their distinctive insignia, flag, whatever you want to call it. So the people were identified by tribes. When you study this period of the wandering, which we will this year in the book of Exodus, you'll see that around the Ark of the Covenant on each side, there were 3 tribes. 3 tribes to the east, 3 tribes to the west, 3 tribes to the north, and 3 tribes to the south. So what you have is, as the people travel from one place to another, and then when they settle and they encamp, they settle by tribes, each tribe in a certain area. So this tribal division continues throughout the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And then when Moses dies at the end of the book of Devarim, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and the people are ready to go into the land, they are taken across the Jordan River by Moses's replacement. Moses, remember, was the national leader. He was the leader of the entire people. He is replaced by his disciple, his apprentice, Joshua. And Joshua brings the Jewish people across the Jordan River, and he leads all of the tribes. He leads the entire nation in a battle of conquest to conquer the land that God has promised, the ancient land that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been promised. The land at that point was called the land of Canaan. The land that we today call the land of Israel was at that time called the land of Canaan, or the 7 nations of Canaan. And the reason they say 7 nations was because there were 7 major settlements of people in different areas of the country. The land of Canaan was made up of 7 major peoples or groups of people that constituted the population prior to the entry of the Jewish people into the entry of the Jewish people into the land of Egypt. I'm sorry, the land of Israel. Are you watching that while we're talking?
No.
Okay. Talking to my technician here for a second. At any rate, when the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, they again constitute a nation. They have to win a battle. They have to conquer the land. And so for a moment, even though they continue to march into battle as tribes, there is one national leader. That national leader is, of course, Joshua. He is the overall military leader. And all of the tribes, for a period of time, de-emphasize their tribal identity, and they concentrate their campaign as one entire nation. And this period of time lasts a few years until the Jewish people have conquered the land of Canaan. And then after the initial period of the conquest takes place, the tribes divide up among themselves the land. Joshua, once the land is conquered, he assigns each of the tribes their territorial portion. They each settle in a certain area of the land. And at that point, the land of Israel returns back to what it was. The Jewish people returned back to their tribal divisions. Each tribe lives in a certain area. When Joshua dies, there is no more national leader of the Jewish people. With the death of Joshua, we have no national leader. So the Jewish people really, for most of their history, I mean, up until this point, they really don't have anybody who leads the entire nation. Moses and Joshua, and then it goes back to tribal divisions. And during the period of what we call the period of the Judges, which is the 200 years that follows the conquest of the land, that follows Joshua, from about the year 1200, give or take 50 or so years, till about the year 1000, give or 50 years, from about 1250 to about 1050, this period of 200 years is known as the period of the Judges. And I think I indicated on the sheet that I sent to you that during this period of time, the Jewish people were ruled by the elders of their tribes, along with each of the tribes' judges and officers, and the religious functionaries, the priests and the Levites. That was the nature of Jewish life, each tribe living in its own section of the land, each tribe tending to its own affairs. And once the land had been conquered, there was no national leader and there were no problems. It was a period, by the way, of relative calm and peace in the land of Israel. This takes place in the early Iron Age. It takes place at a time when Egypt and the powers of Mesopotamia were relatively weak. And so it was a moment in which the Jews could settle in the land, develop their local institutions, and they had relative peace. They didn't have to worry about powerful external enemies. What happens is this period of time is going to give way to the period of the kings. And that, of course, is the theme of the book of Samuel. I mean, apart from studying the history of the Jewish people, the theme of the book of Samuel is what caused the Jewish people to request a king and to go from being a loose confederation of tribes to being a united kingdom. Now, for those of you who have studied with me in the past this particular subject, know I use as an analogy the American Revolution. So I'm going to, please bear with me, those of you who've heard this before, I'm going to use this one more time just to give you my reference point. Initially, America was not a united country. Those of you who've studied American history know that originally we were a series of colonies, and the colonies originally had very little to do with each other. There were northern colonies in New England, there were central colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. There were southern colonies. These colonies were founded at different times, and were most of them, by the way, they were English colonies, so that they had in common. What they had in common was the language that they spoke, most of them was English. But each of the colonies develops in a certain area, and each of the colonies develops with their own unique forms of economics and politics and government. If you were living in Massachusetts Bay Colony, it would be very different than if you were living in South Carolina, which would be in turn very different if you were living in New York, okay? Each of the colonies was a colony, and they had relationships with each other. They dealt with each other, they traded, they conducted affairs one between the other, but they were very different in religious makeup, in their political institutions, in the degree of tolerance that they extended to people who weren't like them. If you lived in New England, for example, they tended to be relatively intolerant of religious differences, even though the truth is that the people who came to New England were searching for religious toleration. They tended, when they got to New England, not to extend that toleration to others. And some of our 13 colonies were founded because people who had lived in New England colonies found it was very stifling. And so where did they go? Some went to Rhode Island, which was freer. Some went to Pennsylvania, which was a little freer. Some went to the very metropolitan and eclectic New York. So each of the colonies had a different way of life, and their economy, as I said, was different. In the South, it was a planter aristocracy, okay? These were people who lived largely through planting. And of course, very early on, the major crop in the South, which was very productive and very economically advantageous to the Southern plantation owners, was tobacco. Okay, and the kinds of crops that were grown in those areas necessitated a lot of laborers, because the labor of harvesting and bringing in these crops was hard, cotton and other kinds of things. And therefore it required laborers, and the cost of laborers would have been prohibitive. So we even see that the institution of slavery, which actually appeared throughout the 13 colonies in the early period, was largely restricted as time went on. It was more of an institution in the South than it was in the mercantile North. All right, so everybody good so far. This isn't, of course, an American history, but we're going through it anyway. All right, so having said that, you know that the colonies, though they were nominally all subjects of King George III, they were all British colonies, and they all had some kind of tie to the mother country, even though not all of the colonists originally came from England. They originally continued on in this manner until a need arose that caused them to have to unite. And what was the need that arose that caused the 13 colonies to have to unite? Their opposition to Great Britain, to George III. Because in their struggle, and just a little English history here, after the end of the French and Indian War in this country, it was a war between England and France, but in this country it was called the French Indian War. In 1763, Britain had incurred such debts that they felt it necessary somehow to raise revenue to pay for what had been a very expensive campaign. And so they had the audacity to suggest that the colonists who had benefited from this struggle might want to pay a little money to help underwrite the costs of it. And the Americans were not too excited about that idea. I mean, the colonists were not really excited about that idea. And what resulted was a system of taxation, which led to a lot of hard feelings among colonists who felt, first of all, that the mother country had no right to tax them, especially if they weren't going to give them rights of representation and the opportunity to have the rights that other Englishmen in England had. It led to what was called the Revolutionary War. And it is largely the pressures of the Revolutionary War that bring the 13 colonies together. You are going to find that the same is true in Jewish history. What will be the impetus, the real impetus, for the separate tribal units? And I find it interesting, 13 colonies, 12 tribes. What caused the 12 tribes to come together and unite? It was largely the response to an external threat, a foreign threat. It was the necessity of coming together to form a way of protesting and then a way of defending themselves against the power of a much greater force. And the Revolutionary War, as you remember, in its early stages, it began when groups of, they were, I don't know whether you call them colonies or states or what you call them at that time, but they sent representatives to the Continental Congress, and they met in Philadelphia, and they sat down together and they decided that they were going to present petitions to the English government asking for relief from some of these onerous taxes and these impositions that were being laid upon them. And of course, things did not go well. The British, after a while, got tired of these colonies. And there was actually outbreaks of violence. Those of you, this is the bonus course. I'm not charging you for a course in American history. In 1770, there was an affair called the Boston Massacre, which really wasn't much of a massacre. I mean, Paul Revere made it sound much worse than it was and depicted it as worse. But the first Americans die in battle with British troops. Shortly thereafter, the Americans, in protest at an imposition of a tax on tea — Americans were great tea drinkers — decided to show the British that they weren't going to get away with taxing their tea. So a group of Boston natives dressing as Native Americans went to the docks where the British ships were moored and they took the tea which was on board, which was to be unloaded and sold with a tax. They took it and they dumped it into Boston Harbor, which became known as the Boston Tea Party. Well, in the aftermath of that, Britain took off the gloves. They became very, very upset. And as a result of that, they decided these colonists are not gracious people. They don't have the right gratitude. They don't understand, and they do not respect British authority. Therefore, we're going to show them respect. Those of you who saw Hamilton, we're going to show them our love by stationing British troops among them and enforcing compliance, okay? And that was not popular. And then, of course, whenever something like that happens and British troops came and they were garrisoned and there was conflict between local colonists and local people in the States and British officers, one thing led to another. And on a fateful day in 1775, a group of British troops setting out from Boston decided to destroy colonial weapons depots and ammunition in a place called Concord. And on the way to Concord in Massachusetts, they met a small group of militiamen in a green at a place called Lexington. And at Lexington, the shot heard round the world. The beginning of the American Revolution takes place. The Americans were badly, obviously outmatched. Many die there. The British go on to Concord. But by the time they get to Concord, the Americans, the natives have hidden all the ammunition and taken the gunpowder and removed it. And as the British attempt to make their way back to Boston, they are attacked on all sides by gathering forces of American militia and frontiersmen who attack them all the way from Concord back to Boston, taking a heavy, heavy toll. And at that point, the situation becomes very, very serious indeed. And it culminates with a famous battle. It's often referred to as the Battle of Bunker Hill, although quite honestly, the hill where the battle took place was not Bunker Hill. It was a hill in front of Bunker Hill called Breed's Hill. The battle takes place, and at tremendous cost, the British win the first battle of the Revolutionary War, but at tremendous cost to Britain. That is the start of the revolution. And while this is all happening, Congress is meeting. They issue a proclamation, which they send to King George, which has since become known as the Declaration of Independence. And they list their grievances and they indicate that they do not feel bound to King George in England, that they have the right as free individuals, that God has given them the right to depose tyrannic government. And they send this message to King George, who is none too happy. And King George responds by sending the largest naval fleet of the world over to the New World, and thus begins in 1776, in the fall of that year, begins the first battles which take place off of New York, off of Brooklyn Heights, and Washington's defeat, and is crossing back to Manhattan and the British chasing the Americans, and on and on and on. It becomes the American Revolution. That war lasts from, say, 1775, 76, all the way, really, the battle part of the period ends about 1781, and finally a peace treaty is secured. All right, why am I telling you all these things? My wife is looking at me like I'm crazy. I'm telling this to you because the problem that the colonies had was, how do you fight a united, well-equipped, strong nation like Great Britain, not only when you are outmatched, not only when you don't have the military might, but when you're divided? If you fight as individual states, you're not going to do it. You have 13 individual states, each has their own armies or militias. There's no general command. How can you fight a war against the united enemy unless you are united? You've got to be united. So Congress unites, and they appoint a general over the colonial forces. And that general, of course, was General George Washington. And Washington in 1776 begins the national struggle, which was fought on many different fronts, to win American independence. This is the nature of small, fragmented tribal societies. In the face of great challenge, they either come together and unite to meet the outward challenge, the outward danger that faces them, or they fail. There is no mid-ground here. If America, what was to become America, if they had not united, there is no way, even with other advantages that they had, they could have ever defeated the British. And this describes, I think, the situation on the eve of the time when the people of Israel asked for a king from Samuel. The nation was divided into tribes. Each of the tribes had its own affairs. Oftentimes, tribes were so preoccupied with their own local battles, their own local issues, their own local conflicts, that they did not come together to help one another. Oftentimes, one tribe was attacked or one tribe faced challenge, and they sent out for help to another tribe, and sometimes another tribe would help, and sometimes it would not. So the tribes had to fight on their own, hoping wherever they could to get local help to help support them in the battle. Sometimes not only did they not cooperate together against the common enemy outside, sometimes tribes fought amongst themselves, just like states in the early colonies fought amongst themselves. They not only had to deal with outside opponents, but sometimes they were in conflict with one another. Usually those conflicts were not military conflicts. They were economic conflicts and regional conflicts, but the states fought, the different entities fought among themselves until such time as the people said, enough of this, we need a united government. So today's lecture, was the introduction to the topic of today called the triumphs and the tragedies of tribalism. And here's where for the next, hopefully 20 minutes, all you're going to talk, I'm just going to listen to you. Sorry for that introduction. Before we talk about the tragedy or the problems of being tribal and not being united, which we talked a little about in my previous course, I want to ask you, what are the advantages of being a tribal society? So let me ask it this way. I'm going to ask the question this way. There are plenty of reasons why small local groups or small individual groups might come together to form stronger, more united groups. But I suggested that there were some benefits, some positive benefits that came about because society was divided. So my question to you is this, let me ask it. Can you tell me some of the advantages of the Jewish people living in the time of Joshua and after that in the time of the judges, some of the advantages to their living as tribal groups with their own local leaders and their own local systems of government and of life? Can someone tell me, or would someone like to venture to talk about some of the advantages? Joseph, why don't you start us?
Well, I would think in smaller clans with a lot of families that know each other, relate to each other, there's a better chance to have a very common culture, and the people being in a smaller clan type of structure, each individual voice could probably be heard a lot more than if it was a giant nation. So it probably had a lot of the people's voice were probably stronger in a organization like that.
Very good. 2 points Joseph makes. One, in a smaller society where people know each other face to face and they live in similar conditions because they're living in a common area, they probably, one, know each other better. They're more familiar with each other and the problems that they face on the local scene. That's number one. And because they are local and because they communicate with each other, they probably get along better. They probably are better able to face their local problems. And even today, by the way, we talk about government on a national level or on a city level, but most of the things that affect you in your life, I can tell you from living here in Santa Clarita, one of the things that affect you most is what happens in local government, probably as important in some ways as who the president of the United States is. What the city council does here in Santa Clarita has more impact on our day-to-day lives than what's happening in Washington. I can tell you the quality of our life is governed by such mundane matters as waste disposal, pickup, local ordinances, local systems of government. Most of the decisions that affect our children are made by our local Board of Education. Those of you who live in Los Angeles, you have a giant system called the Los Angeles Unified School District. But here out in our community, we have smaller local units, and local units, as Joseph says, are more responsive to the needs of local citizens, okay? You want your voice to be heard. There's a better chance that your voice is going to be heard if you live in a community of people who share your situation and where your individual voice counts for more. So I think those are the good points. Anybody else? Any other advantages to localism? Go ahead, Michael.
So in addition to being able to be heard more, when you want to be heard, there's no going on a 3-day trek out to be heard and a 3-day trek coming back, or when you need some action, some decision, that's all that you don't have to go out and get the decision and then come back. Answer.
Yeah, I wanted the way in which, for those of you who've never read it, Robert McCullough writes a wonderful book on John Adams. And it starts out by John Adams heading toward Philadelphia. And the physical trek that was involved in going from Massachusetts in the winter to Philadelphia, it was more than a 3-day trek, and it was hard. And that was at a time when they didn't have a postal service. So if you were in Boston, you had to go to Philadelphia. That took time. You had to send letters. Right. Local government was local. That was the thing. If you were local, you didn't have to wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months or 10 months to get problems resolved. You went to your local city council, or in the time of the revolution, you went to wherever you went to, when we went to, I forget what it was called, Colonial Williamsburg, we saw where the people met. You went to your local people, you spoke before them, you spoke to your neighbors, and decisions were made. You did not have these inordinate periods of time between having a problem, placing the problem before people who could solve it, and having it resolved. Very good. Anybody else? Anybody else? No? No? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think you were asking the disadvantages, and obviously the concerns, the major concerns of one tribe may be totally indifferent as far as another tribe's concerned, but you do need their support. And they probably don't understand as well as you do what they need in order to confront the major force that you're against.
Very good. The dangers when you're local, you know what you need, and your issues are your issues. People outside your area may not understand your issues, and they may not sympathize with you, and they may not be there to respond to your needs. So on one hand, localism is good if you're dealing with local problems, but as the nature of the problems grow bigger and you need the support, as Mike said, of other people and other interests, then that's a disadvantage of localism. You have to convince other players that it's in their interest to work with you. Again, the revolution. In 1776, each of the states had their own interests, and poor John Adams is sitting there arguing with people from Philadelphia and New York who have their own interests, and it's hard to get everybody on the same page. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to mention. Anybody? Carol, go ahead. Carol?
Living and working and governing within a small group, you have better chance to develop leaders.
Very good.
It's a very good place to learn how to lead people, how to inspire people, mm-hmm. And then you can aspire to the next level and become a good leader of many more people.
Very good. Local government is a laboratory in which leaders are produced. Most of our national leaders began running for school board, for city council, and if they succeeded, maybe they went to be representatives in their state or state senators, or maybe they held a certain office. The nature of local government it is a training ground for leadership. It is a way for people to learn leadership hands-on. And usually local government isn't as difficult to crack into and isn't as set in its ways. You can make more of an impact and you're freer to experiment and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes in local settings. So the local setting is a place for individuals to aspire to leadership. And everybody wants to be a leader of some sort. Not everybody gets to be Moses. Not everybody gets to be King David. But if you want to be a leader in your own right, if you're in your own community and you're an elder or a judge or an officer, you begin to develop the skill set that is necessary to become a leader, okay? So here's my list, and then feel free to add to it anything you want. People feel closer to local communities and associations. People feel closer to the people who live in small communities, feel their local leadership is more attentive to the problems that they face. People feel more in control of their choices and options in smaller groups. You have more of a chance of making a difference in smaller groups. Smaller groups encourage local leadership and involve more people who are interested in issues that affect their lives. It is training for leadership. More local control, the local groups exercise more local control over issues and policies. It ensures better knowledge of the issues that a particular community is dealing with. It is a chance to, it provides a chance to experiment with different policies and leadership styles. It provides greater ability to learn from group failures and successes. It prevents the accumulation of power in the hands of fewer, more distant centers of power, okay? One of the great dangers of placing power in hands of people who are farther away and who control much more power is the individual voice is lost. And here in America, we understand that we feel sometimes powerless. The executives, the people, the government in Washington, whether it's theoretically our senators or our representatives, we feel that they don't hear our voice. At least our assemblymen in the United States, our representatives, we can change them every 2 years. Theoretically, we have the opportunity to send the entire pack, to tell them to leave and go away. It doesn't happen that way, but we theoretically can change government every 2 years. With our state senators, it's harder. It's every 6 years. But when government becomes more distant and when power is concentrated into the hands of fewer people who have more authority, it is often the case that greater corruption and inaction can occur. That's when you have gridlock, and that's when you have people passing the buck. You want to talk about bureaucracy, okay? Your local officials are far more responsive to your grievances than the state is, and the state is more responsive than the national government. Why? Because as you go up the system of power, and as larger and larger areas of authority are concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, it's easier to avoid responsibility for the decisions that you make. It's easier to come up with reasons why you can't change anything. And consequently, many people feel, what difference does it make what I say? An individual voice like mine is not going to make any difference in a nation as big and as powerful as ours. And finally, I'm going to leave it at that. There are others, but I'll leave it at that. All right. So with all that being said, you might think to yourself, you got to be crazy to want to invest power farther away in fewer hands. It sounds like it would be more ideal if everybody lived in local governments, right? More responsive, you get a chance to have more hands-on, you know the people that lead you because they're directly responsible to you in your community. You can change them if you like. If I have a problem, I knock on my representative's door, his field representative, and I say, I'd like to speak to so-and-so. And because I'm in his district, he's going to be more responsive to me than someone else who doesn't know me from Adam, all right? So what would cause then, this is now the problem, what then causes people to give up local government or greater forms of government? Okay, there's the question. And by the way, I've left out the religious component. The Jewish people ostensibly believed that they were all people who were governed by a common law, and that was the law of God. And that law was interpreted by judges and by officers who were all committed to the same law. Even though the Jewish people were divided up into 12 tribes, each of the tribes followed the Torah, and the laws that governed them were the same kind of law. So a judge who was living in, say, the tribe of Naphtali was applying the same law as a judge living in the tribe of Shimon. Theoretically, it was one and the same law, so you had a common law. Why, therefore, give up local government for national government? And that is the question that we have here. Go ahead, Erwin, you can take that.
Well, there are some very obvious reasons why they would want to go that way, and that is obviously defense, common defense. They're obviously stronger as a group than they would be in individual small tribes. There is also access to economic products from a more diverse economy, which they wouldn't have any otherwise. More opportunities for learning and development and wider cultural opportunities, as well as economic opportunities. So, you know, there are probably many others, but these are some of the top ones that I can think of.
That's brilliant, Erwin. You've hit a lot of them. First of all, you've hit the obvious area of response to outside forces that are more powerful, that require combined action. As we're going to see, the major impetus that led the individual Israelite tribes to come together and ask for a national leader was generated by an outside force, which I will identify toward the end of our session tonight. There was an outside enemy who arose during the period of the judges. It was a small force, it was a small people initially, but as time went on, even though the Israelites were able to to defeat the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and the Agagites and the Gershonites, there were these smaller nations. There arose a people who became so powerful that the individual tribes were no longer able to handle them anymore. They needed to unite. So Erwin's first point is that tribalism, factionalism, division is not effective when you face an outside threat which demands that you come together. But Erwin also cited something else as well. He cited economics. You know, the tribe of Dan lived by the sea. The tribe of Issachar lived by the sea. What was their economy? Fish. They were fishermen. Oh, okay. They were fishermen. Other tribes lived in areas where they grew things. They were agriculturalists. Other tribes lived in areas that had natural forests, which produced other kinds of advantages. Different tribes lived in different areas. Now, a local tribe might specialize in one area or another, but as Erwin says, as life becomes more complicated, as life develops, as people mature, as the people's needs for other kinds of products besides essential services grows wider, as they become more affluent, you begin to look to other areas. Each of the tribes had its area, but as time went on, the people began to realize there was a benefit in coming together. Okay. What's it called? Something of scale, economies of scale. Not everyone has to appoint their own governor, this, that, or the other. You don't have to duplicate things again and again. When you have organizations over a wide area, you can utilize the special situations and talents of people in different areas to help make your civilization easier. And so as economic interests begin to develop, these different tribal areas begin to recognize the benefit of not only trading with, but of establishing commercial relations with and ties with other areas of the country. And of course, because trade was so essential in the Middle East, suddenly you began to discover that when you had to go through borders, this was a big problem. One of the early problems, by the way, after the United States was formed and after we gained our independence, was states were charging tariffs against other states. There was economic warfare of one state against another. It was united in terms of government, but they were so factionalized in terms of economy that things weren't working out. They didn't even have a national currency. They didn't even have one national currency. You had to do business with people in different areas. You didn't even have standardization of practice. You know, Alexander Hamilton was famous for creating the national bank and assuming the national debt. These are things which a more organized, a more structured, a larger society can do. Well, the Jewish people and the tribes were like that too. It wasn't just a matter of dealing with outside enemies. It was a matter as the influence and the power and the interests of the state began to grow, people began to realize that there was a certain benefit to coming together to avoid duplication of resources, duplication of personnel, and to work together with one another. And then apart from that, imagine that the individual tribes are fighting with one another, okay? Forget facing an outside common enemy. What if you're fighting with one another as local entities, as states? Those of you who took the course in Judges know that not only did some of the tribes not come to the help of other tribes in moments of need, they actually fought with each other. The tribes of Israel who worshiped the same God, followed the same Torah, okay, ostensibly were one family, they would fight with one another, and they would fight with one another over jealous, petty matters. There is a story in the book of Judges that a group of tribes get together and they defeat the enemy. And one of the tribes, Ephraim, who was not invited to join the coalition, gets mad at the others and says, "We're one of the greatest tribes in the land, and you didn't invite us to come and participate in the struggle." And we have fights among tribes themselves, petty fights, because of internal differences. And then, of course, there is the whole question of anarchy. What happens when, as conditions become more and more difficult, what happens when order breaks down, when you cannot assume that there is one law that governs everyone, when people are fighting other people, when people, where territorial boundaries limit your effectiveness? That was the state of Israel toward the end of the period of the Judges. So much so that one of the last events we read about in the book of Judges is a story about how all the tribes go to war against one of the tribes, the tribe of Benjamin. And they almost eradicate, they almost decimate the tribe of Benjamin to the point that they fight amongst themselves and they almost wipe out one of the tribes of Israel. You can see how that kind of a society, especially in the face of this rising power, and I will now identify the rising power, they are sometimes referred to as the Sea People, but you will know them as the Philistines. With the rise of this mighty empire, an empire which was very sophisticated, it was probably Mediterranean in origin, it probably came from Europe or from the Mediterranean islands, as they established a beachhead in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and they became stronger and stronger. They posed a greater and greater threat to all of the tribes of Israel. None of the tribes of Israel could defeat them individually, and the Israelites were growingly aware of the fact that even together they might not be able to fight them unless they came together and allied themselves with one another and established one national unit. And that was what led the people to turn to Samuel, who we will now, when we're ready for his story, that was what led the Jewish people to turn to the last of their great leaders, Samuel, and to say to Samuel, we cannot go on this way any longer. After 200 years of loose tribal confederation, of loose tribal leadership, depending upon local charismatic figures called judges to save us in periods of danger, we need a king. We need what other nations around us have. We need one national leader who will represent us, who will go out before us and come back with us from battle, who will serve as the leader, and under whose rule the entire area of the 12 tribes will be unified as one country. And that is what leads us to the period of the kingship. All right, now this is actually a relatively shorter session, so I'm going to pause here. And if you have any questions, we'll talk about it. Okay, this is the setup for chapter 1 and for next week. Go ahead, Erwin.
So, Rabbi, I thought we learned that the Philistines were there when the tribes of Israel crossed the Sea of Reeds, and that was one of the major reasons for going east as opposed to going directly north.
Correct.
So, were they there, or did they come? Did it come along and place themselves on the seashore once the tribes were already in Canaan?
Excellent question, Erwin. Very good question. In fact, they were there before the Israelites got there, but they were just starting to establish themselves, and they had established, the Philistines come into the land of Israel shortly before the Exodus. The Philistines actually, a sea people, they attacked Egypt. If you want to see these people, they made an attack on Egypt itself. They were beaten back, but they made an attack on Egypt originally, while the Hebrews were still slaves, by the way, during the period of the slavery in Egypt. They were beaten back by the Egyptians, but they managed to establish themselves in these settlements along the Mediterranean coast. And Erwin, at the time of the Israelite Exodus, they had begun to establish 5 city-states. They weren't yet the mighty power they were going to become, but they established themselves in places like Gaza and Gat and Ekron and Eglon, and I forgot the name. There were 5 Philistine city-states. They were growing in power. They were not yet the power they were going to be, but that was, you're right. They were already on the coast when the Israelites began their migration. So they actually got to the land of Canaan during the pre-Israelite period, during the period of the Canaanites, okay? But what happens is as time goes on, see, because the Israelites originally settled in the hill country, one of the reasons they couldn't conquer the coast was because they had to deal with the Philistines. As time goes on, or when over that 200-year period of the Judges, the Philistines grow more and more powerful. You begin to see that they began to expand outside their coastal strip along the Mediterranean, and they begin to move inland up to the mountains and the plain areas where the Israelites had established themselves. So it was only a matter of time. Initially, Israel avoided them, but as time went on, Israel could no longer avoid them, because as the Philistines became more powerful, they were going to run right directly into, they were moving in the direction of the Israelites. So that's the answer to your question. Okay. All right. I realize that tonight's lecture perhaps might not be as interesting. We're not doing literature tonight. We're doing history, but hopefully you at least have a context for what is going on. Now, I should say a word about Samuel, and then I will give you your assignment for next week. Samuel represents the most interesting and the most complex ruler of the Jewish people since the time of Moses. Samuel, in many ways, is closer to Moses than Joshua was. Why do I say that? Okay, and he's an interesting fellow. First of all, like Joshua and like Moses, Samuel is a prophet. Remember, a prophet is a person to whom God speaks, to whom God delivers a message, to whom he gives an assignment, and the prophet is then charged to speak to the people and to realize God's purpose among the people. Samuel is a prophet. God speaks to him, and you will hear on many occasions that God speaks to Samuel, not in the way he spoke to Moses, but he speaks to Samuel. Number 2, Samuel is the last of the great judges. By judges, I mean the charismatic leaders of Israel. There were a series of judges, individuals, leaders who the Jewish people looked up to. Samuel was one of the last generation of judges. So not only was he a prophet, he was also a judge of Israel. People would come to Samuel, the place where he lived, and he actually also was a circuit judge. He went from town to town and place to place. And when he came to places, people would come to present to Samuel problems that local leaders seemed not to be able to solve. So Samuel was a judge like of a higher order, such as Moses was, for problems that were larger in scope than the local leaders could handle. So he was a prophet, he was a judge. Like Moses, he was a teacher. Okay, remember Moses is great, was a teacher. Samuel was as you will see, was a very famous teacher. Samuel was also known as being a seer. If you had it, and we don't have that in Israel so much, but if you had a question and you needed an answer, he was not an oracle, but people came to him. Not only did God give him messages, but people came to him not only for advice, but for other kinds of matters as well. And he was known as being a wonderful counselor. If you had a problem, you came to the prophet Samuel and you told him his problem and he gave you advice. He wasn't quite the oracle of Delphi, but he was a kind of a seer as well as a prophet, seer as well as a prophet. Then, if that's not all enough, Samuel was a Levite. He came from the tribe of Levi. So he was a religious functionary, okay? And he grew up as a youth. His mother devoted him to the service of God. So he served under the Kohen Eli. So he was a religious leader of the Jewish people. And if all that wasn't enough, he was also something of a military figure as well. So in Samuel, you get the last of the great all-in-one leaders of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, Samuel did not have sons who could continue on. And when the time comes and Samuel gets older, the people come to him. And the text will tell you that they had no trust anymore in Samuel's sons because they were not like Samuel, their father. And therefore the people said to him, we want you to appoint us a king, a ruler over us. And Samuel is resistant. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to do it because he basically believes that people are wrong in asking for a human ruler when God should ideally be ruler of the Jewish people. And Samuel is compelled to do this against his will when God himself essentially says to Samuel, look, Samuel, don't take this personally. It's not you and your family that the Jewish people are rejecting. They are really, God says to Samuel, it's me they're rejecting. They want a human king in place of me. And I have allowed, as we saw last week, I have permitted them to have this. And therefore you will serve me and you will appoint their king for them. You will appoint actually the first two kings of Israel. So Samuel now becomes the pivotal figure, okay? Samuel will die. As a matter of fact, Samuel will die before the end of the first half of the book of Samuel. So even though we call the whole book of Samuel, Samuel as a figure will die in the first half, and he will have done two very significant things. Number one, he will have anointed the first king of Israel, King Saul. And then when the time comes, as God's spokesman, he will denounce Saul, announce that the kingdom has been taken away from Saul, and he will instead, in his place, anoint the destined future and forever king of Israel, David and David's dynasty. So Samuel is going to be a pivotal player in the history that follows, okay? For next week, I'm going to assign to you a very familiar story for those of you who go to high holiday services. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, as the Haftorah for the day, we always read the story about a Jewish mother whose name was Hannah. Hannah was a woman who was married to a man. She was actually one of his two wives. And Hannah's husband loved her, as you will see, very, very much. She was very important to him. Unfortunately, Hannah was unable to give her son a child. She could not bear a child for her son. And therefore, for her husband. Thank you, Rand. She could not give her husband the child. And therefore, she is very despondent. The man's other wife, a woman by the name of Penina, she has 7 children. And poor Hannah is like Rachel in the Bible. She's desperate to give her husband a son, but she cannot produce a son. And then as you read in the first chapter of the book of Samuel, she is praying one day in Shiloh, the shrine, the center of Jewish life. And she is confronted by the high priest, Eli. And Eli questions her. And she tells him her plight. And he tells her that in the following year, she will give birth to a son. And Hannah makes a vow. He says, if in fact God hears my plea and he gives me a son, I will give him to the Lord. He was already a Levite, but she meant she would offer him to God. Samuel, by the way, was one other thing I forgot to mention to you. He was a Nazirite. A Nazirite is something else. We'll talk about that. So she dedicates Samuel to eternal service to God. And sure enough, she gives birth. The following year, after giving birth and weaning the child, she brings the child to Eli, and Samuel is raised in the Mishkan and with Eli and the priests, and Samuel will become the leader of that pivotal point in Jewish history. Okay, that story is found in the book of Samuel, chapter 1:1 to chapter 2:11. So it's not a long reading. Those of you who are familiar with the holidays, you'll recognize it, you'll realize it. I'm going to send out tomorrow, because with this, you need to be guided in your reading. I'm going to send out a series of questions. So don't look for the notes for tonight's session tomorrow, although this will be posted. I'll send those out too. But I will send out a series of about 5 or 6 questions that I want you to think about as you read the material for this week, because I've spoken far too much this week. So I've got to get you to speak next week. But I'm going to ask you some questions about this early history of Samuel. In many ways, the story of Samuel that's told in this first chapter is like rereading the story of Moses. Now, this miraculous young man, this improbable child who attains great importance and influence in the history of the Jewish people. So when you read the story of Samuel and you read about Hannah, who is like the mother of Moses and the sacrifices she makes, if you say to yourself, this story sounds familiar to me, this sounds like a slightly different version of the story of Moses, you would not be far wrong. Samuel is one of those figures who, even from before his birth, it's clear he is designated for a very special purpose. Okay, so that will be the material that I will send you in the question form tomorrow. I'll get it to you so that you have plenty of time to read this material. All right. Are there any questions tonight? A little shorter than usual. Any other questions? Neil, go ahead.
I'm just verifying something. So Samuel was not the first king. He was the last judges.
That is correct, Neil.
Okay.
Samuel was the last of the old leadership. He was a judge, both a judge in the sense of the judge period. He was both a charismatic judge, but he was also physically an actual judge. He actually heard and judged cases. He is a prophet. Yeah. Samuel is the last of the old generation, a last of the old leaders. He will now give way to the new leaders. Very good.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, anybody else? All right. So